By the mid-1970s, Deadwood, South Dakota was no longer the booming frontier town it had once been. The gold rush era was officially over, but small-scale mining operations still dotted the hills surrounding the town. These were not corporations or large companies. They were family-run claims, passed down through generations. Life in Deadwood followed a rigid structure. Men worked underground for long hours. Families lived close together, often on the same land their grandparents had settled decades earlier. Disputes were rarely taken to court. Problems were handled privately, usually within families or between them. At the center of this story were two extended families, both deeply rooted in local mining. The first was the Hawkins family, led by Frank Hawkins, age 52. A respected but stubborn mine operator whose claim bordered one of the oldest tunnels in the region. His sons, Daniel, 29, and Luke, 26, worked beside him daily. The second was the Morrow family, headed by Earl Morrow, 55, equally experienced, equally territorial. The Morrows believed that a newly exposed vein of gold ran beneath land they had worked since the 1950s. For years, the disagreement remained quiet. Survey markers were moved. Boundaries were argued. Accusations were made, but never proven. Each family claimed the other was encroaching underground, digging tunnels that crossed invisible lines no one could officially confirm. By 1974, tension became visible. Miners stopped sharing equipment. Local suppliers took sides. Conversations at the town's only bar fell silent when members of both families were present. Younger relatives, cousins, and brothers-in-law were pulled into the dispute without fully understanding its origins. Despite the hostility, no one expected what would come next. Deadwood had seen fights before. It had never seen a massacre. By the winter of 1975, rumors spread that one family planned to force the issue, not through courts or inspectors, but through a confrontation underground where witnesses were few and authority rarely reached. And once that idea took hold, the feud moved toward a point where there would be no turning back. By early 1976, the disagreement between the Hawkins and Morrow families had moved beyond landlines and paperwork. It had become personal, fueled by exhaustion, declining profits, and the quiet fear that the gold sustaining both families was running out. Mining in Deadwood was no longer lucrative. Yields were unpredictable, equipment was aging, and safety inspections were rare. For many miners, the claim was not just a workplace, it was survival. Losing access to a vein of gold meant losing everything. The conflict intensified when several Hawkins miners reported hearing activity beneath their tunnels late at night. Tools echoed through rock where no one should have been working. Timber supports were found disturbed. One tunnel partially collapsed, narrowly avoiding serious injury. Frank Hawkins accused the Morrows of illegal underground expansion. Earl Morrow denied it publicly, but privately told relatives that the Hawkins family was stealing from under their feet. Meetings were attempted. They failed. What made the feud more dangerous was how quickly it expanded beyond the two patriarchs. Brothers, sons, nephews, and cousins were drawn in. Some had never worked the disputed tunnels, but felt obligated to defend family honor. In Deadwood, refusing to take sides was seen as betrayal. By February, the feud had fractured the mining community. 23 men, all related by blood or marriage to one of the two families, began working in coordinated shifts. They avoided public spaces together. They traveled in groups. Several were known to carry firearms, not openly, but close enough to reach if needed. No one contacted state mining authorities. There was a shared belief that involving outsiders would permanently shut down the claims. Silence, once again, felt safer than intervention. The final catalyst came in early March, when a local prospector reported seeing multiple men entering the old Black Hollow shaft. After midnight, a section of the mine long considered unstable and officially inactive. Black Hollow sat directly beneath the disputed boundary. It was the one place everyone agreed no one should be. 2 days later, both families agreed to meet underground to settle the issue once and for all. The decision was not written down, not recorded, and not acknowledged publicly. Each side believed they were arriving to defend themselves. None believed they were walking into a disaster that would leave 23 men dead. The meeting at Black Hollow was scheduled for the night of March 18, 1976, long after the last legitimate shift had ended. The mine was officially closed, its ventilation unreliable, its supports weakened by decades of use. But for the families involved, secrecy mattered more than safety. They entered in small groups from different access points, carrying lanterns and handheld lights. Some brought tools meant for work. Others brought weapons they insisted were only for protection. No neutral party was present. No agreement had been set in advance. According to later testimony, the atmosphere was tense, but controlled at first. Frank Hawkins and Earl Morrow stood at opposite ends of the main tunnel, flanked by sons and relatives. Accusations were exchanged quietly. Maps were unrolled, then dismissed. Each side claimed the other had crossed lines that no one could prove existed. The argument escalated when one of the younger miners accused the Hawkins family of sabotaging a support beam days earlier. Another responded by calling it a lie. Voices rose. Men stepped closer. Someone attempted to intervene, but was ignored. What happened next unfolded in seconds. A light was knocked to the ground. In the confusion, a struggle broke out. Whether the first act of violence was intentional or accidental was never conclusively determined. What is known is that once it began, it did not stop. The confined space worked against them. Visibility was poor. Air circulation failed. Gunfire echoed unpredictably. Lanterns shattered. The tunnel filled with smoke, dust, and panic. Men who tried to retreat found their paths blocked. Others were struck by falling debris as supports gave way under stress. Within minutes, parts of Black Hollow began to collapse. Those who survived the initial confrontation were trapped. Oxygen levels dropped rapidly. Communication between groups ceased. In the darkness, some miners became disoriented, unable to tell friend from foe. By the time the mine fell silent, 23 men were dead, some from violence, others from the conditions that followed. No one emerged to report what had happened. The entrance to Black Hollow was left undisturbed, sealed by rubble and fear, as the town above continued its routine, unaware that the dead lay beneath their feet. By morning, the absence was noticed, but not questioned. Families assumed delays. Mining schedules were often irregular, and it was not uncommon for men to remain underground longer than expected. Wives waited. Children were sent to school. Deadwood moved through the day, unaware that nearly 24 men would never return. It was not until the second night passed that concern turned to fear. Lanterns were found abandoned near one of the sealed entrances to Black Hollow. A mule used to haul equipment stood unattended, still tethered. When relatives attempted to enter the shaft, they were forced back by unstable rock and foul air. Local authorities were finally notified on March 21, 1976, 3 days after the meeting. By then, rescue was no longer possible. State mine inspectors and emergency crews arrived to assess the collapse. What they uncovered over the following hours confirmed the scale of the disaster. Bodies were found in clusters, some near collapsed supports, others scattered along narrow passages where they had attempted to escape. There was no single point of death. Instead, investigators concluded that the men had died during a sequence of violent confrontation followed by structural failure, compounded by smoke and oxygen loss. Determining individual responsibility proved impossible. Evidence was destroyed by the collapse, and surviving participants were few. What shocked officials most was not just the number of dead, but the relationships between them. Every victim belonged to the Hawkins or Morrow families, connected through blood, marriage, or long-standing alliance. This was not an industrial accident involving random workers. It was the result of a feud carried underground. Deadwood was placed under state oversight within days. Mines were shut down. Claims were suspended. Families were interviewed repeatedly, yet answers remained fragmented. Survivors offered conflicting accounts. Some refused to speak altogether. By the end of March, the tragedy was no longer treated as an accident. It was officially classified as a criminal investigation, one rooted in family loyalty, secrecy, and a decision that should never have been made. The investigation that followed faced immediate limits. Black Hollow was unstable, and large sections remained inaccessible. Recovery teams could not safely reach every area, leaving some bodies unrecovered for weeks. By the time full access was restored, much of the physical evidence had been destroyed by collapse, water seepage, and time. Interviews produced more questions than answers. Surviving relatives acknowledged the meeting had taken place, but denied knowing it would turn violent. Each family blamed the other for bringing weapons underground. No one admitted to initiating the confrontation. With no clear sequence of events and no neutral witnesses, prosecutors struggled to establish individual responsibility. June 1976, a state grand jury was convened. After weeks of testimony, the conclusion was cautious and frustrating. While the deaths were not accidental, there was insufficient evidence to charge any single person with multiple homicides. The tragedy was attributed to reckless collective behavior, aggravated by illegal mining practices and deliberate secrecy. No murder convictions followed. Instead, fines were issued. Mining licenses were permanently revoked. Civil lawsuits moved quietly through the courts, ending mostly in out-of-court settlements that satisfied no one. For many families, the lack of accountability felt like a second loss. Deadwood changed almost overnight. Mining operations collapsed economically. Younger residents left. Businesses that depended on miners closed within a year. The town's identity, once built on gold, shifted towards silence and avoidance. The Hawkins and Morrow families never reconciled. Funerals were held on separate days. Graves were placed in different sections of the cemetery. Children grew up knowing which surnames to avoid. Even decades later, residents spoke of the tragedy in fragments, never as a whole. Official records now list the event as the Black Hollow Incident of 1976, a case study in how family loyalty, when placed above law and safety, can turn a dispute into a catastrophe. And in Deadwood, the mine remains sealed. Not as a memorial, but as a reminder of what happens when conflicts are buried instead of resolved. In the years that followed, Deadwood never truly recovered from what happened beneath Black Hollow. The mine entrance was eventually reinforced with concrete and steel, not to preserve it, but to ensure no one ever entered again. There was no public ceremony, no plaque, no official day of remembrance. The decision was intentional. Many believed that marking the site would only reopen wounds the town was desperate to keep closed. For the families, grief unfolded in isolation. Widows relied on relatives or left town entirely. Children grew up with fragmented stories about fathers and uncles they barely remembered. Some were told their loved ones died in an accident. Others were told nothing at all. Silence became the inheritance passed down through generations. Former investigators later admitted that the case haunted them, not because it was unsolved in the traditional sense, but because everyone involved understood what had happened. And yet no one could be fully held to account. Responsibility was shared so widely that it dissolved. The law, designed to address individual guilt, was powerless against a tragedy born from collective decision-making. By the early 1980s, Deadwood's population had declined sharply. Mining was replaced by tourism and history, but certain stories were never included in brochures or guided tours. Visitors learned about gold rush legends, not about the night 23 men died underground. Among longtime residents, one belief persisted, that the real tragedy was not the violence itself, but the moment the families chose secrecy over safety, when pride outweighed caution and loyalty silenced reason. Once that choice was made, the outcome was only a matter of time. Today, Black Hollow is invisible to most. Trees cover the hillside. Trails pass nearby without signs. Yet beneath the ground, the tunnels remain, sealed, unstable, and filled with memory. A place where a family feud crossed into something irreversible. The story of 1976 is rarely told in full, but it remains one of the darkest examples of how ordinary disputes, when buried instead of confronted, can claim far more than anyone ever intended. And in Deadwood, that lesson came at the cost of the 23 lives. What happened in Deadwood in 1976 left a mark that went far beyond the families directly involved. For the wider community, the tragedy became a cautionary tale passed down quietly, without dates or names, often reduced to a single sentence. That's why you don't take family business underground. It was a way of acknowledging the past without reopening it. Historians who later reviewed the case described it not simply as a mining disaster, but as a social failure, a moment where economic pressure, inherited grudges, and rigid family loyalty combined in an environment that discouraged outside intervention. The mine did not create the feud, it only confined it. The men who died were not criminals in the traditional sense. They were workers, fathers, brothers, and sons who believed they were protecting what belonged to them. In choosing confrontation over compromise, they walked into a situation no one could control. Deadwood learned, too late, that isolation can magnify conflict. Without oversight, without mediation, and without trust in external authority, disputes hardened until there was no room left for retreat. When the collapse came, it was not only rock and timber that failed, it was an entire system of handling conflict. Today, records of the Black Hollow incident are sparse. Official reports are brief. News articles from the time are cautious in tone, careful not to assign blame too directly. The absence of detail reflects the reality of the case. Much was lost underground, and much was never spoken aloud. What remains is the lesson that when families choose secrecy over safety, when pride replaces restraint, and when conflict is buried rather than resolved, the consequences do not stay contained. In 1976, 23 gold miners went underground believing they were defending their family's future. They never came back. And in Deadwood, the ground has been quiet ever since, not because the past was resolved, but because it was sealed away, along with the cost of that final decision. The tragedy of Deadwood ultimately became a story without villains in the traditional sense, and that may be what made it so unsettling. There was no single gunman, no clear mastermind, no moment that could be isolated and condemned without ambiguity. Instead, responsibility was shared across families, across years, and across a culture that taught disputes should be handled internally, far from outside eyes. For decades, former residents avoided discussing Black Hollow in detail. Some feared legal consequences. Others feared reopening wounds that had never healed. Many simply believed that speaking would not bring anyone back. What remained was absence. Empty houses, abandoned claims, last names that quietly disappeared from town records. Deadwood rebuilt itself on the surface, but underground, the past stayed intact, sealed behind concrete, silence, and unresolved questions. The mine was never reopened. No one tried to reclaim what lay beneath it. In official history, the Black Hollow incident is described in careful language, a fatal confrontation compounded by unsafe mining conditions. In private memory, it is remembered as something far heavier. The moment when family loyalty crossed a line from protection into destruction. The men who died in 1976 did not set out to create a massacre. They believed they were ending a conflict. What they failed to see was that some disputes cannot be settled by force, especially when pride and fear are allowed to guide decisions. Deadwood learned that lesson at an unbearable cost, and though time has passed, the story endures, not as a warning shouted aloud, but as one whispered quietly through generations, that when conflicts are buried instead of resolved, they do not disappear. They wait. If you made it to the end, comment the phrase Black Hollow below. Share this video with someone who appreciates serious documentary-style true crime and help keep these forgotten stories alive.